Join us this new year for new conversations at the Commonwealth Club.
Welcome to the Commonwealth Club. I'm George Hammond, Chair of the Humanities Forum, which organized tonight's event. I'd like to welcome our live audience here in San Francisco, and also our live stream audience watching this, and also everyone who watches it later on YouTube. This is one of over 700 programs that we've done at the Commonwealth Club since the pandemic began, bringing to you now with live audiences again, the authors, the politicians, and the political affairs issues that the Commonwealth Club has been doing for over 119 years. Tonight we have Tobias Wolff and Katherine Wolff, who are here to speak. Katherine has written a book called Beyond: How Humankind Thinks About Heaven. And Tobias Wolff has written many, many books, but we're going to focus a little bit on the autobiographical memoirs, This Boy's Life, and In Pharaoh's Army, because there's a relationship between our imaginations, our creativity, and what we think about what's going to happen next when we're done with these lives that we're reimagining. So thank you very much for joining us, and thank you for joining us, Katherine and Tobias. And welcome to the Commonwealth Club. Thank you. So to start, in your book, Katherine, you quote Sir Thomas Browne, writer from the 17th century, who said that when we talk about the afterlife, when we talk about what comes next, we're a lot like two young fetuses in a womb discussing what adult human life would be like, which they're expecting. That is totally ignorant and filled with imaginary ideas. So why don't we start there and say, in this case, for this conversation, that's what we're like. We're like triplets in a womb here, and the womb is the Commonwealth Club, and we're going to try to get some understanding, not only about what we think, but about what has happened for the last thousands of years, what a lot of people said. And I think it's really important to remember that everybody whose ideas we know about basically were writers, and that writers are a very small proportion of the population. So we really don't know what everybody's thinking about this. We know what writers think about things. And it's part of, our writing life. Writers are all talking to each other across time, across space. It's very important to us, but we are a small percentage of the population and how we look at things. Mm-hmm. So this was your project. How did you decide to kind of summarize and go through all the different views of mankind on heaven? That's quite a project.
Well, it wasn't my idea. An editor suggested it to me, and I said, well, I'll give it a shot. And after 6 weeks or so of research, I realized that the idea of heaven was actually a rather limited sort of set of ideas in just the sea of ideas, of imagination and artistic expression that started well before there was any writing, that's for sure, and continues to this day. And so I was sort of in the position of one of your little people in the womb thinking, who am I going to talk to? Who do I, how do I find out things about this? Because, of course, nobody ever seems to come back with a verifiable report as to what it's like.
Mark Twain did complain about that.
Well, he did.
Among many other things he complained about.
I was very fortunate to find very quickly that in every major religious tradition and now in modern times when the idea of heaven is not, and the afterlife is not necessarily packaged in a religion, that they're travelers. That there are people who have gone there and come back to give their testimony. And you may say, well, why should I believe them? For much of history, the very fact that they proclaimed what they had seen proved to their audiences that it existed, way different from how we think about it.
Yeah. I think it's a lot like Marco Polo's travels. You said travel. So Marco Polo traveled, and he came back with all these stories from China. And we know that China is real and that there was a real China then, but we know that his stories about what he saw there are not all completely accurate. And if you had people come and visit New York City for the first time, for example, it's real, but everybody would walk away with totally different stories. So I'm kind of on the page that, one of my favorite near-death experiences, you talk about the secular things. It's interesting in this last century, because of modern medicine, we have a lot more people who come back and tell stories. And one of my favorites from a guy in Marin got killed in on a motorcycle accident. And he said when he came out of his coma after 3 months, he was in a Buddhist sect, had a guru, and the guru had died. And he said that during the time that he was on the other side, that there was a female angel that told him it was time to move on. And he also met his guru, who told him, no, your work isn't finished, you have to come back. And that they fought for the whole 3 months over what he was supposed to do, which gives you an idea that maybe the afterlife is just the same as what we do here. Just an idea.
I'm sure I like that idea.
I don't think anybody likes that idea. The first thing that they, just like you said, the first thing that people really don't like was when they find out their neighbors actually get to go to heaven too.
Yeah.
And nobody likes that idea.
Well, there are still whole systems of thought that maintain that there are other places as well we go that is not necessarily a good place, and that comes out of our sense in all religions that we live in a moral universe and that there's some kind of moral valence to our actions and that somehow we get our just desserts. And that's a theme that's gone all through religious thought and now into, modern thought was not necessarily tying it to a religious faith, but feeling as though what you did on earth does set you up in some way to what will happen later. It may not be that you are condemned by a deity. Mm-hmm. It may be that you have to go through a progression before you are ready to go on to the next life, that you have to make amends and come to terms with the way that you lived your life. And so that's an interesting thing that has sort of gone from being the sort of crowd control of religion, where you can't do that or else, to people having a very realistic sense that whenever and however they go, they may not be ready for whatever is coming. And then you contrast, that's one way of looking at how you feel as you move along. Then you have the mystics in every religion who feel as though they can go there now. Through spiritual discipline, through meditation, through prayer, and that they either reach a sort of temporary transcendence, or they actually are in the presence of a deity, or, as some people would say, they just have such fabulous imaginations that they have created a kind of universe for themselves where they are with a deity. So.
Yeah, one of the things I find interesting about most of the reports is a lot of people say, I felt that I understood everything and that I was one with omniscience and so on. And you always wonder why they don't retain more of that information for us when they come back. If they had momentary omniscience, they usually don't have almost anything other than the experience to convey. They don't have any new medical information. They don't, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So it's.
But they often change their lives.
But they change exactly. They not having the fear of death does change people. There are tribes, that fought the Persians in the 7th century BC, who believed in reincarnation, and they fought fearlessly because they just figured it doesn't make any difference. This is what I do.
Yeah.
And that scared the heck out of regular armies who didn't have that belief system.
Yes.
So I have a question for you, Tobias. When you're thinking about this imagination that we reimagine the experiences that we've had, and Catherine mentioned just desserts. You have a story in Old School about Ayn Rand coming to the school, and in a way, you kind of give her just desserts in the novel. and I was just wondering if that story clearly made up. I don't think, I assume that Ayn Rand did not come to the school that you went to or based on. But you clearly wanted her to experience something of what it would be like for an outsider to see her.
Yeah. Well, certainly, you're right. She did not come to my school. A lot of Robert Frost, who I described coming to my school, did in fact come, but Ayn Rand did not come. But she figured importantly in my imagination of that novel. So as Catherine did with her subject, I immersed myself in Ayn Randia, and I read as much as I could bear of her work, and again, which I had been addicted to when I was a teenager.
Right.
And boy, if there's an argument for growing up, anyway. But I went back to it, and then I read some of her essays in a book called The Virtue of Selfishness, and then I read her letters, and they were just revelatory. Her meanness of spirit was utterly undisguised in her letters, and as was her philosophy. And so I thought, I can speak, I can inhabit this person, at least in a fictional universe. And so that reading her letters heartened me in terms of giving me some sense of license, if you will, to imagine her if she had come and the sorts of things she would have said. But, you know, Catherine has in some way diminished her responsibility for this book by saying that someone else suggested it. When he dangled that possibility, she was on it like a barracuda. It's a kind of culmination of a lot of work she's been doing anyway. Catherine went back and took a graduate degree in theology after our kids had grown up. This is something that is central to her. And she edited a really fine book called Not Less Than Everything, dealing with questions of faith. And so it was a real natural for her. And boy, it was the minute that locked in, she was on it. And I mean, it's such to take on the subject of the afterlife is so daunting because we have so many ideas of it, and so many of them are. I mean, we're barricaded in these ideas of the afterlife, and they make good cartoons in the New Yorker, the people sitting around on clouds saying funny things, or in jokes, you know. 3 men show up at the pearly gates at the same time. I won't tell that joke, but I could. See me after. You know, you think of, say, G.K. Chesterton said that any description of the afterlife that he'd ever encountered didn't sound like any good day he'd ever had. And George Orwell has a great line about it. He said to him, it always sounded like choir practice in a jewelry store. So that's the kind of thing she was up against in a way, these popular conceptions of the afterlife. And you know, to come up with such a, not just a fresh vision of it, but a fresh way of looking at the idea of it. There is no one way of looking at it, and so many of these faith traditions have their own. But you said, not, Catherine, just a moment ago, you said, you know, not condemnation, but let's not forget condemnation, because that's part of the fun of it. One of my favorite things in her book, and this happens in more than one faith tradition, is that those who are good and you know go where you'd want to go, part part of the goodness of going where they're going is that they get to sit on a kind of balcony and observe the sufferings of the bad. I mean, what's the point of being good if you can't see bad people suffer, right?
That was Thomas Aquinas.
That's Thomas Aquinas you quoted on that.
Yeah,
But you said something that struck me. I'd never thought of this before after all this research and writing about how you felt it was sort of delicious for you to give Ayn Rand just a few of her just desserts. And I'm thinking of how, particularly with notions of hell, which I didn't get into too much, but they seem to be dreamt up by people who are pretty angry, a lot of other people, and have dreamt up really creative endings for them. I mean, there's one in Zoroastrianism where women who refused sex with their husbands had to lick a red-hot iron forever. There's one in Tibetan Buddhism where a man who was greedy is given a stomach as big as the universe that's empty, and a mouth that is the tiniest hole in the universe, and the tiniest straw, to try to get something, and that's his hell trying to get. And so I'm thinking, people are thinking, I know that guy. I know what I want to have happen to him. And of course, it's a terrible thing to say, but these descriptions of what happened to people in hell are often a lot more interesting than what apparently happens in heaven, as in Orwell.
Right.
Choir practice in a jewelry shop.
Somebody should do a statistical analysis of the readers of Dante and see how many read hell, how many read purgatory, and how many read heaven.
Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah.
I'm sure hell is the winner.
Yeah, purgatory is pretty interesting too.
Absolutely. Oh, no. The Inferno is really, that's got your attention.
That's good.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Satan in a frozen lake, gnawing on Judas
Yeah.
and Brutus.
And of course, the Pope that was really nasty to Dante is right near the bottom.
Oh, yeah. He throws
Angry
a lot
people
of people
is
in
right
there. Absolutely.
And
Oh,
Ugolino.
before we leave the New Yorker cartoons you mentioned too, there was one about Ayn Rand not too long ago that you'd like.
Missed it.
And it showed a bunch of stalks of corn that weren't doing very well, and a farmer and his son were there, and the stalks of corn were all reading books by Ayn Rand, and and they were not doing very well. And the farmer says to the son, the reason the corn can't mature is because it's still reading Ayn Rand.
Oh, that's great.
Oh, that's wonderful.
That's great.
So let's go back to the beyond for a second.
Okay.
There's a lot of stories. One of the things that's interesting is how much more concrete and detailed it's become over time. A lot of the ancient Greeks or the ancient Jews had a very vague idea about, and that it wasn't very pleasant. There wasn't, it was that you were a shade, and you really weren't having any fun.
Yeah.
I don't know why singing hymns is that much more fun, but it's a little more detailed. So you talk about the influence of Zoroaster and their ideas on the idea of the afterlife that eventually influenced Judaism and Christianity.
Oh, absolutely,
Yeah. So
because
let's tell about
there
that.
you have that kind of big dualistic universe where there's Ahura Mazda is the god. There had been a great battle in heaven, and then Angra Mainyu was the devil figure, and the realm split, and it's light and beautiful up there and horrible down there. It very similar to what you get in the Christian sort of cosmos. Not so much in the Jewish cosmos, because they have the most wonderful idea about hell, which is that it's really almost blasphemous to say that a God who is infinitely merciful would ever allow anybody to languish forever in a hell, which I think is kind of great myself. I like. It's one of those things that I learned. I thought I like that idea. Yeah.
If you push that one really hard, you get a lot of converts.
Yeah, absolutely.
If that became clear to people.
Yeah. But I think we're still fighting that dualism,
Yeah.
actually. Interestingly enough, if you can stand to educate yourself a little bit in this, or have somebody help you. The whole idea of the quantum universe and the way in which evolution, a lot of people are talking about evolution as not just a physical process, but as a process having to do with will and intention and meaning. This would be the theologian Teilhard de Chardin. That whole idea of, the good, the bad, the great, the light, beautiful place and the horrible, dark place, it's just not working anymore. Not that one does not sense the presence of evil in the world. I have to say that. But there's just this sense that, there aren't way other realms outside this universe and some other reality. Maybe we're talking about the reality that we are in this universe, and that we're just coming towards something that we don't really have the capacity to grasp.
Yeah.
At this point. So a great deal of humility is in order.
Yeah.
A great deal of humility and a little less fear, or a lot less fear.
Indeed.
One of the stories that, of course, is very popular and repeated all the time, although it's not exactly in the Bible, about the start of heaven and all that, was that Satan rebels, right? Well, Satan rebels, and he convinces 1/3 of the angels to leave with him, right? That means that heaven is escapable, right? Because it's supposed to be eternal. It's supposed to last forever. But 1/3 of the people made a decision that allowed them to escape. Now, whether that was a good idea or not, under the circumstances, but it does. It's interesting to me how the images and the stories don't match the ideas. And I want to go back to you, Tobias, on that, because that's true in autobiography and in all kinds of writing. You have a certain amount of ideas, and the readers don't get the same thing that the writer was trying to convey. I think you mentioned something about Camus on that one too. So why don't you talk a little bit about that? Because here we are, like that story gives away information. Just like there's something in the New Testament where Jesus is asked about Jerusalem. When is Jerusalem going to be destroyed? And he says, heaven and earth shall pass away. He talks about, I don't know. He says, I don't know. Only the Father knows when Jerusalem will be destroyed. But heaven and earth will pass away, but my word will not pass away. In that very short thing, he undercuts all kinds of ideas. Because when he says that heaven is going to pass away, that means it's not eternal. The other thing he says is that my Father knows something that I don't know. If they're both equally omniscient, that's not really possible. Or if they're one mind. So when people tell stories, it's very convincing. But readers can see things that weren't intended, or were unconsciously intended, or were unconsciously conveyed. And so I'm sure you've run into this with your readers telling you, this is what you meant, and you say, oh, I didn't really mean that, or I didn't think of that.
Well, that does happen from time to time. But I have to say that often when they point that out, I see that it's there, in spite of my intention. And if it's something that they see as, really contributing to the virtue or power of the work I've done, and then of course I intended it. But yes, you mentioned Camus. I'm a great admirer of his novel, The Stranger, and taught it in my classes for years as one of the books that I taught. And one of the interesting things about that book to me is that when he talked about the book after he'd written it and gave interviews about it, he once used the expression, Meursault, the main character, is the only Jesus we deserve, he says. And indeed, at the end of that novel, Meursault, who is being executed for murder, a wanton murder, paints himself. He's narrating the novel in a kind of Christian panoply of images, And all that is left, he says at the end of the novel, for me to complete my happiness are the cries of hatred from the crowd. What does that remind you of, right? So he's deliberately setting Meursault up as a almost a kind of Christ-like figure dying for the truth because he won't pretend to feel things he doesn't feel, like guilt, for example, or love. And in fact, that isn't the character that Camus actually wrote, a martyr to truth, as Camus seemed to see his own character. He lies to others, he lies to himself, and he's a much more interesting and complicated character than this one that maybe Camus set out to write. And I just find that so interesting, the way the imagination works, that sometimes we do better than we mean to do in our imaginings. That we succeed to levels of complexity and exploration that our first kind of blueprint imagination of something really doesn't account for. It's a riotous faculty that we have. It's something that's a little beyond our control. That's why we call it a gift. It's not something we can command. And God knows, as one who tries to command it day after day, I know that it's not obedient. And it will give itself when it will. So the imagination is such a, it's quicksilver. It's elusive.
But you're making me think of the way in which so many of the images and teachings about heaven or other realms in the afterlife, would have been promulgated by somebody. Dante was the best, probably. But readers, people who would have heard of these visions and contemplated them, they make them their own. And there's a way in which I see our imagination as being collective. It's one of the things that struck me from the very beginning to the very end of the book is that no matter what people imagined about what was going to happen beyond, they never stopped wondering. It was as though there was something drawing them that they had to respond to. And so they go about it in very different ways, but we keep doing this. So humans have this incredible legacy of imagination because that's really all it is. Not that I should say all it is because that seems pejorative.
Yeah.
It's magnificent.
Yeah.
And it points towards a truth.
It's interesting.
You say something, I'm sorry,
Go ahead,
George, but you say something in your book that I think is really wonderfully encapsulates this. You say somewhere in your book, I remember the sentence, this is not a history of heaven, it is a history of our imagination of heaven. And I think that just nails what you did in it,
It's all it could be.
It's all it could be, right.
And if we look at our major histories of what human beings have done for the last 5,000 years, those writings are also imaginations of what actually happened. We know that this is not accurate.
Yes.
I think we're at a very interesting point here in the beginning of the 21st century because the 20th century was so good at materialistic science that an idea came up that unless you can measure something, you can't really know it. But that eliminates 80% of our lives, right? Because we can't measure our emotions, we can't measure our relationship, we can't all kinds of things, and we know that all those things exist. So our emotions exist, and even though they can't be measured, and I think whenever an idea is doing very well, it kind of dwarfs other ideas and kind of gets in their way and stuff like that. So I expect that to say, we're really, really good at this, but we need to also understand and try to understand using reason or whatever we want, our imaginations, our creativity, to understand these other parts of life. But one of the things that is interesting to me in your book was so many different religious ideas or stories had to do with light. Okay?
Yes.
And these have to do with light. So why don't you talk about that a little bit, and then we'll...
Well, And that's an interesting thing when you think about a collective imagination and a kind of this sort of effort of humanity to try to figure out where we're going. That common images do appear, and common themes. I mean, the themes that we live in a moral universe and that compassion is a central virtue. Those are really constant. The image of light and the image of a bridge. Those are two that come up again and again and again, that when we leave this world, we go on a bridge somewhere. Will it be capacious because we have expanded ourselves and become graceful and grateful people, or will it become knife edge sharp and not get us where we're going? Will there be demons on either side? Will our conscience be hounding us? It starts in Zoroastrianism again, and it turns up in Islam, and it turns up in Buddhism, and it turns up in Christianity. You can find stories of the bridges after, and so there seems to be some truth there that we're getting at, because we keep coming at it from every culture, whether we've heard about each other's images or not. And the other one, as you said, is the light, is the Ahura Mazda in the realm of light. Obviously, when you look at Dante's Paradiso, it's the ravishing, the showers of stars and the ravishing light that he's blinded by. And with the near-death experiences, that is one of the really common elements, that people come through a tunnel. They don't start a bridge. They're about a tunnel or some sort of passageway into the light, which then often takes shape into a figure of some sort. But the light is a constant, as is the bridge.
Interesting to me, because light is a physical phenomenon. We know that it's photons being expelled by atoms, and we know how long atoms last. They last a long time. So there could be some reality to this situation, that it's not biological bodies or whatever, but there are bodies made out of atoms that we really know that create light, and there could be. But we also should know, just like with history of the religion, history of our civilization and politics and everything, 95% of it is probably inaccurate.
Is probably
probably inaccurate. That seems to be about what the average is, at least. I think I'm being a little generous, actually. But so it's thinking about it from that reality point of view. What is it that draws you in and says, this is something that's useful not only for how I live my life now, but for the future?
Oh, I have got some people I really want to see. And that's one of the most basic human sort of yearnings that comes up in any kind of vision of the afterlife, is that our friends and our family, people we love, will be there. Let's talk about maybe people we don't want to meet. Perhaps there will be a solution to that too. Yes, I mean it gets for me. I had such a kind of standard. I hate to say a hallmark notion of heaven before I started this, but I didn't think about it much, and it exploded my head with ideas about what it could be like, such that I don't want to say. I certainly believe in an afterlife, but I'm really agnostic about what it's going to be like, because I don't think we're at a place in our evolution where we can actually understand what it might be that is happening out there, and that we may be in a progression that's going to take a very long time through many, many lives, whether it's reincarnation, whether, like with the Mormons, you progress through many, many worlds after. That what really spoke to me about a kind of realistic and also merciful way to look at our progress there, at our movement towards the afterlife, is that it is a progression, and that at every point of the way, really, if we're mindful, we have a choice as to whether we will act justly and with compassion, and to have some hope that is contributing to a general flow of the human race. I do pray that today.
And it seems to me that so much of what we've believed satisfies our psychology, right? And so you mentioned this thing about relatives that you want to see. I think most people, if you told them that it was going to be anonymous, that they would prefer that to the choir image, to see people that they really know. And actually, there's some surveys and so on that 20 to 40, 50, it depends on percent of people have talked to deceased relatives or have imaginations or dreams.
Yeah.
So let's talk about dreams for a second. We talked about light. Here's another area of our life. I mean, there's some probing of our brains while we're sleeping and stuff like that. But everybody on an everyday basis fills their mind with light and makes stories out of it. Your own dreams are like you have a screen and you put it on and you completely remake it all the time. You tell yourself stories. People say, well, it must have this reason or this basis, but it probably has just as many motives as the rest of our lives. We might be practicing for something else. We might be afraid of something else. It's probably just the same. But until we kind of say, how do our minds do that?
Yeah.
How do our minds do that? I think we don't know what our minds are, and that's a daily basis. You can even do it. I mean, some people can daydream. So they're alert, they're alive. I mean, not alive, everyone's alive when they're sleeping, but they're conscious and they can still visualize these things. And people with good imaginations can do it when they sit down to write. So, right? So the stories. And so our minds do this. And it's not like only yogis and bodhisattvas that have this experience. Every single person has this experience. So that has to be it's
inexplicable. It's such a mysterious thing to me, imagination. I'm in awe of it because I have been in periods of drought and abundance, and why it happens now, why it happens another or doesn't happen is mysterious. You have to be there and hospitable to it and for it to happen. But it's one of those things. I'm thinking of a wonderful parable that the Chinese sage Chuang-Tzu tells about there's a frog at the bottom of a deep well, and all day long this frog looks up at this little tiny circle of blue above him, and he sings all day long of his vast knowledge of the heavens. Okay. And I feel we're a little like that. I mean, that, or as Chuang-Tzu elsewhere says, we see the heavens through a straw. And we are so circumscribed in that way, just even by the accidents of our birth, of our family, of the place we grew up, the faith that we grew up. All these things make a straw of our vision, and we are trying continually to enlarge that field. But these questions, I feel as I get older, an increasing humility about my ability to feel confident in the answers to those questions.
Well, your book, Beyond, is a great example of expanding that straw because, you were raised a certain way with a certain set of beliefs, like you said. You had a certain idea about heaven, and then you went through all this. And it's fascinating to see, especially because you did go outside of the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition too, and look at the other major religions that have influenced people's thinking. And there's some similarities and some wildly different, ideas. So how did you feel going into those things? Did you find any territory that was very uncomfortable, maybe?
No, not really. There are certain forms of certain faiths that I think are in error, and so I don't take them as the legitimate expression of the faith.
Yeah.
I found that my whole worldview was absolutely Jewish, which I loved, being raised an Irish German Catholic, and I don't know why I was, that wasn't acknowledged. I felt a great attraction to the Sufi form of Islam. Yeah, and so there were things that really opened me up, but I can say very few. I can't even really think of anything except for anything that was so condemnatory and so absolute in its judgment. But that's really very rare.
Yeah.
That's really very rare. And in most religions, there's a little minority opinion that actually you judge yourself. You know, which I think is a lot of wisdom to that. And that's an out. And there are also little minority opinions in most religions that if you don't want to keep going in life, and you don't cultivate that hope and reach for that experience in some way during this life, maybe you end. Maybe that's it.
Well, it's interesting because you said before about the progression and how important it is to a more genial, compassionate way of looking at what we're up to, right?
Right.
What I always find interesting is that when there's a goal, you know, so the purpose of our life here is 1, nirvana, or 2, enlightenment, or 3, get to heaven, or 4, you know, become as rich as Bill Gates, or whatever goal you set. What's missing from all of those analyses is that's what gives meaning to your life. That's the idea. So what happens when you reach the goal? Then your life has no more meaning, because you have gotten to heaven. You can't get to heaven. You're not supposed to be able to leave heaven. But I mentioned the alternatives. But I find it very interesting, and it shows up unconsciously as in the stories that are told, which I think are some of the reasons that both Christianity and Buddhism became very popular. I think they have a strong similarity. Buddhism was not popular for the first 300 years or so. And then a monk came up with the idea of bodhisattvas, and then it became very popular. Now, why? Because the bodhisattvas are on the verge of the goal of life, and instead of going over the edge, they look back and they help other people get there. Okay? Which means that if you're one of the people they're helping, that you're more important than the goal of life to the bodhisattva. That makes you the center of the universe again. I mean, emotional center of the universe. And of course, almost everybody wants that to be true. And I think the same thing happened in Christianity with Paul. That is, Jesus said a lot of very interesting things, but it took this idea that God loved you so much as a sinner that he let his own son die in order for you to be saved, which means you're more important than his son, and you're more, emotionally, to you. It might be inaccurate, and that might be not intended by Paul, and not intended by the monk that told the Bodhisattva story. But it is implied in those stories. And that's where I think the power of those ideas comes from, because we do live life from inside our minds out, and we can pretend that we're the center of the universe until we mature and realize that there's a few other billion human beings and a few quadrillion other minds at least that we know about.
Well, I would say two things. One, the idea that we might get disappointed with what's, the ideas of what people tell us is coming, may be part of why we have such an extraordinary proliferation of ideas about what's coming, because we just get tired of them. They're too small for us. We outgrow them. Yeah. I do think there's a huge difference between getting to be as rich as Bill Gates and getting disappointed. And being somewhere else, because at least for me, there's an essential truth that we will be free. Mm-hmm. And be in a stage of extraordinary growth, mm-hmm. in a way that will leave any disappointment that I might have, that it's not quite what I expected. It's going to be gone. Mm-hmm. It's going to be gone. But it's interesting though. I asked a very smart Jesuit about what his notion of heaven was, and he said, "Well, you know what? Actually, maybe people just get what they want." Which is another way of approaching it. However, if you're, I just don't feel like I'm a big enough person or spirit or soul to really know.
Well,
I'm too small now.
This is a very good angle on heaven as far as I'm concerned. What your Jesuit father said. Everyone gets what they want, because I think a lot of the stories, that's exactly what they are. Somebody's
Sure.
saying, "I get exactly what I want,"
And the guy I hate gets does something horrible, right?
what they don't pay attention to is what all the other players in their vision get. You know, and because those other players, the bit players, who are supporting them in their role in heaven, like for example angels, you know, they're supposed to be eternal. There's a hierarchy, you know, of angels. What would it be like if you were like at the bottom of that hierarchy and you had to stay there for all eternity? Would that be fun for that angel? It might be useful to the people that they're helping, but from the point of view of that particular angel, and I think that this is part of telling stories where you don't quite get the people that are too far off the main stage, right? And I think we tell a lot of stories like that.
Yes, the answer that Dante gave and others in other religions gave were that people who might have been in the lower heavens, angels or whatever, are filled to their capacity, and so they have no idea that they are lesser. That would be the answer.
Yeah, that's an interesting answer. Because somebody created all those people with their limited capacities. And so one has to look and say, why was that choice made? But in any case.
Well, it would be an odd heaven to go to and then be eternally envious.
Yes, yeah, it would be, wouldn't it?
Yeah. I mean, as a friend of mine once told me, he said, envy is the only one of the cardinal sins that gives no pleasure. Think about it.
That's great.
That's
a very nice observation.
Gluttony, yeah, it's upside, and so on. But envy, no.
Well, you have a line in your book about that, I think, was it not from Dante, but something about that in heaven you're happy and no one can be envious, right? Yeah. That you can't be envious in heaven. No matter where you are in heaven, you can't be envious. I remember that one. I'll look it up.
Probably part of Dante's section.
Yeah,
yes.
Probably Dante.
Yes.
So it's right in line with what you're saying. Somebody else has also said that can't really work now, can it?
You can't know how it can work. We can't know how it can work. See, that's why it doesn't bother me. These kinds of problems don't bother me. They're problems generated by the limitations of our own minds.
Yeah.
That's a really good way of looking at it. Now, but when you look at it and you've seen all the other ones, you made choices about which ones seem to be more afflicted with the limitations of our own minds than others, right? Some of the ideas you found, like the ones that are based upon angry, attempts to be cruel to other people because you don't like them and stuff like that.
Yeah, or any
It's
exercise.
just so transparent what's going on.
Or your exercise of your religion is actually harming other people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So in your books, in Pharaoh's Army, speaking of cruelty, you have a great story about the Vietnamese army playing a cruel trick on, not so much on you, but as on the guy who was going to replace you. And you're embedded with the Vietnamese army. This is autobiographical, right? You went to Vietnam, right? So you're embedded with the Vietnamese army, and a guy who is a kind of a big blowhard comes to take your place. And they trick him into thinking that he's dancing with the niece of the general, but it turns out to be something else. And you tell the whole story, very fascinating story, and they just have like one line. You said the humor of the military or of soldiers can be very cruel.
The rough humor of soldiers.
The rough humor of soldiers.
Right.
Yeah. So in a way, that reminded me of how we deal with people that have done things that we don't like. I think some people would have an easy time having a very rough, cruel humor for Hitler and Stalin and all these people that have done so much damage to us. So in writing that up, you used a tremendous amount of restraint, which made the final thing much more powerful. So I'd like to talk a little bit about that in writing. This idea, because people talk about it in movies, they talk about it in art, in all forms of art. And that restraint we don't have a lot of when we get to the beyond. It's exuberant. It's from both ends. But in our art that we tell each other, it might be a small group that likes it, but there's a small group that thinks that's the highest art, to have that restraint. So was it conscious to approach your art that way?
I suppose the writers that I admire practice that restraint as I think a form of respect for the reader. That you don't need to, as little as you need to tell the reader that that you trust the reader to understand. That's a kind of respect for the reader that has its reward for the writer in the reader's delight in discovering those things which are there to be discovered because you have made them available to be discovered, but you haven't rubbed the reader's nose in it. And I mean, Hemingway's best short stories, for example, Chekhov's stories, Catherine Ann Porter stories are examples of that kind of art, I think, and of understatement, of implication. And implication needs a partner. It needs someone who understands implication and delights in it. And so there's a kind of conversation, a reciprocity that goes on between the writer and the reader that you hope will happen. And so that all reading these writers, loving them, no doubt altered my own DNA as a writer, and in ways that I'm not just calculating this all the time, but it becomes a kind of part of your writer's nature in a way, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So you're both writers. You're married to each other. Do you do this for each other? Do you act as the reader for each other's books, and does that help your marriage? Or it's a very
certainly helps me as a writer, and I will leave it to her to say that other part. But no, when I've actually brought something as far along, I rewrite a lot. When I've actually got something as far along as I can imagine bringing it. I can't see what else to do to make it better. That's when Catherine is the first person I show my work to, and she's a really good reader and really helpful to me in reimagining something if it needs to be reimagined. And Catherine pays me the compliment of showing me her work when she has written something, and I respond. We don't pull our punches because that's not helpful.
Right.
I don't think it's so much as a compliment as that I actually need your help.
Well,
But Toby and my daughter Mary Elizabeth were really patient through this book and just went at it. I'd give them chapters because I really had to make sure that all this information that I was trying to get into form that would be accessible to people, and they had to tell me that. And every now and then, they would. I mean, he stumbled over this whole idea of a spiritualized body. Okay, when your resurrection, you have a spirit, and he said, "How can this be? This is completely paradoxical. It makes no sense." But that's, that is a paradox that we had to learn to live with because it's the only way that a lot of religions can refer to any sense of a body that is resurrected.
Yeah. For some reason, the resurrection always reminds me of the 19th century character who made a fortune because he bought up land right outside the gates of Jerusalem, and he sold them as cemetery plots. This is before Florida swampland was sold. He sold them as cemetery plots so that you could be first in line at the final judgment. I thought, wow. God is so easy to fool. It's a good thing he's not omniscient. I mean, it's a good thing he is omniscient. That's another part of our imagination where we fail. almost every religion has a goal of heaven or an afterlife of some kind or a reincarnation, and a set of rules of how to get to that goal, right? And you have to get, so there's a line, and you'd think that, at least among overachievers, that they would try to stay as high above that line as possible. But almost everybody dances right along that line, which means that they kind of believe that what's below the line is what we really want, and what's above the line is told that we're supposed to want, but we're not quite convinced of that. There are a few that dance as high as possible, and they usually end up in the Sufi mystics or the that kind of thing. But the average person definitely is a dancer along the line, which means that almost everybody believes they can outsmart an omniscient God. Right? Which is another interesting part of, our approach to him. and our narcissism being pretty extreme,
Yeah, hasn't worked for me.
You can count me out of that number of people. No, I don't think so. There's a wonderful scene in The Brothers Karamazov where the family the father and his sons have been to see Father Zosima in the monastery, and they come back, and the old man is a total reprobate, but something has kind of stirred him up that day. So he goes around the table and he asks his sons, "Do you really believe in God? Really?" And he got one of his sons, Ivan, is a clever lawyer who is an atheist and who actually delights himself in writing defenses of obscure and absurd church positions. He walks his wits that way. And then there's Dmitri, who's a wild man, but he says, Ivan says honestly, no, I don't. I can't. And Dmitri, for all his wildness, says, Yes, I do. And then Alyosha, he says that, yes, honestly, he believes, and comes back to the old man, and boy, he has every. He said, I wish that I didn't believe, because there's a profit to be made for him in not believing. It would be altogether better for him if there were not a God. But as he would see it. But he said, but if there's no God, who is laughing at us? And who is laughing at us? And I don't even take that to be an uncharitable laughter, but the way you laugh at the absurd antics of a child you love,
right.
And they'll go on and do all kinds of things in their life and whatnot, but at this moment, there's something that, if only they knew, right? You would think. Yeah. And maybe there's something of that we're aware of that, I certainly don't think that I'm outsmarting that one who's laughing at me, though.
That's good. That's a rare accomplishment if you could put that on your tombstone. I know I didn't outsmart him.
That's right.
Well, Catherine, what in your studies about this? I mean, the book is filled with, hundreds of pages of details of all the different religions and what they believed and why they believed. So it's a lot. If you ever want to have a nice, relatively concise way to understand what our imaginations have done over the centuries, it's a great book for that. But what, for you, is a detail that you think most people don't quite know and stood out for you as something that was entertaining or enlightening for you to find out and write about in anything?
Oh, my goodness. I think one is not necessarily a detail of heaven, although one of my very favorite ones was a Puritan named, I think it's Richard Baxter, who had a beautiful choir. And he said that actually singing together is the true taste of heaven. That is the one true taste of heaven that we have. And I sing in a choir, so that means a lot to me. Yeah. But I think not in a detailed way, but just in the way I started understanding the imagination and how it had come up with these myriad images, and with the use of symbols and metaphors and all these ways we try to put some shape on this thing that that we feel is out there. Many of the scholars that I read set forth this theory, which I love, which is that, just as I was saying, we're on this quest because we keep understanding there's something that's drawing us there. But they talk about the imagination and the symbols and metaphors that we come up with as being literally participating in that reality, that there's somehow, when they come up with a beautiful metaphor, for me, a lot of it is Dante with the ravishing light, or the sense that the cosmos is what God sings. I mean, that's just, I'm dazzled by that in every way. And what they say, and of course, these are people who, if not of a particular faith, have some kind of faith in a reality out there. That a rich metaphor like that can actually give you the experience of what it's pointing to. And it actually comes alive in that. And I think, I think back to what I mentioned before with the light and the bridge and other things, that those have been such resonant metaphors for human beings in every religion or non-religions, that they point to a truth. They point to a truth. Now, if you're a scientific materialist and you think we end when our atoms just fall apart and we die, that this is meaningless. But how much of life, as you said, would we be missing if we were to take that? I feel bad. That's such a limited way of looking at the life that we've been given, and I would so much more prefer to live with that kind of imaginative sense that I can somehow find a way to express, to find a word, to find a picture, something, a story that actually it's harmonizing or resonating with a truth way out there that I really can't conceive of at this point, but I know it's there.
Well, I like to take Pascal's wager and turn it on its head myself and say that there's only two possibilities when you die. One, either you're dead and you're gone, or you're still alive. One of those two things, right?
Yeah.
Now, if you're dead, you're not there to be unhappy. You're not saying, I got fooled, or anything else about having believed. None of that is there. You're not unhappy. Anything that you anticipated, it's all gone. You can't be afraid. You don't experience anything. So if you're gone, that's it. On the other hand, if you're still alive, you probably are in exactly the same state of mind as you were before you died, more or less. I mean, otherwise your personality will be totally different, and you won't recognize yourself. You can't suddenly be different. And if you're still pretty much the person you were, then how you deal with life, with your imagination and your creativity while you're alive, is the most crucial thing. And since there's no reason under those circumstances to be afraid of what's going to happen and so on and so forth, that whatever comes, whatever it is, whatever happens. I think it's a little bit more like saying, instead of having faith that God exists or that heaven exists or that the afterlife exists, it's faith that if something exists like that, any of those things, that it makes sense, that it's probably beautiful, rather than because we're the ones who make cruelty and the things that kind of get in our way. Or that whoever's in charge at least has a fairly decent personality. We think that way about people, who are creative, et cetera, et cetera. Well, they may have weaknesses and stuff like that, but generally they must have a decent personality to be creative and try to give things to other people. They're at least sharing. So it's at least got that. And I think that's the image that Jesus gave, which I thought was one of the great ones. That just imagine the best father that exists and multiply that 70 times 7 times. And that'll give you some idea about what my father's like. It gives you an idea. So I have an idea called the imagination's horizon, where I say that wherever you are, you can see so far to your horizon, and that's your imagination. And the more you study, the more you grow, the more you do things, the further the horizon is, and so you see further. And people have a difficulty with this. A lot of the stuff about the afterlife is obviously on the other side of that horizon. We don't really see it. We just imagine it. But your imagination can be either your enemy or your friend. You can either make it your conscience, which is yelling at you all the time. You're not where you could be.
Yeah.
But if you say it's a progression, the further along you get, the further out you can see, the more unhappy you could be the whole time that you're not where you are. And instead say, oh, this is the way imagination works, and just recognize it and don't make it your enemy.
Right.
And then you're all set. You're set for progression in an enjoyable way. And you have something wonderful. We have just time. One thing I'd like to say about, let's see. Yeah. Somebody wrote in from the live stream and said that they're really enjoying this and that they have your books and your book on their shelves right behind them while they're watching it.
How
So
lovely.
Oh, good.
wanted to mention that.
That's
Somebody in
very
Marin
nice.
County. So you have something that you wanted to read.
I just wanted to read this.
Yeah.
This is from a wonderful, wonderful man, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. If you haven't heard of him, read at least one of his books called The Sabbath, and then you'll never stop reading him. Here are his thoughts that are very germane to what we've been talking about. Citizens of two realms, we all must sustain a dual allegiance. We sense the ineffable in one realm. We name and exploit reality in another. Between the two, we set up a system of references, but we can never fill the gap. They are as far and as close to each other as time and calendar, as violin and melody, as life and what lies beyond the last breath.
Beautiful.
Since we just had our 119th birthday at the Commonwealth Club, so ends another event at the Commonwealth Club in its 120th year of enlightened discussion, and enlightened is actually a very good use of the word for what we just did. Thank you very much,
Thank
Catherine and
you.
Tobias Wolff.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. And we'll see you again.
Thank you.